Hello and welcome to the Storeroom of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson, and today we're going to be doing another topical study related to the book of Revelation with a guest interview. I'm pleased to welcome Cindy Beaver to the Storeroom of Scripture. Cindy and I became acquaintances through the Advanced Apologetics Facebook group as moderators, along with my previous guest, Carrie Griffel. Cindy and I have another thing in common, which is that we both work vocationally in the world of computer science, even as we're both passionate about our avocation in biblical studies. Cindy completed a 2-year Bible study program called Crossways with Dr. Harry Wint and is a certified graduate of the Awakening School of Theology founded by Dr. Michael Heiser. She's been a regular guest on the Genesis Marks the Spot podcast hosted by our mutual friend Carrie, adding great insight from her reading of the many primary sources and scholarly treatments of ancient Near Eastern material. So, Cindy, welcome to the Storeroom of Scripture.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm so happy to be here today.
I've listened to you and Carrie talk over various aspects of biblical theology over at the Genesis Marks the Spot podcast. And a few times you mentioned trade guilds and how they're interconnected with really all of daily life in the ancient world, including religious aspects of life. And so after hearing that observation, I reconsidered the text of Revelation with an eye to trades and economic issues. And I was surprised, actually, at how often they crop up in John's visions. But before we get into some specific passages from Revelation, I'd like to give you the floor to talk a few minutes about economics in the ancient world, about trades, and how they are important. Do you give us a little bit of a brief overview of trades in the ancient world?
They were far more sophisticated than most people give them credit for. The ancients had weights and measures that even in Hammurabi's code, and Hammurabi's code was like 2500 BC. And, so that they were trying to be very consistent. Think about, you go to your gas pump, and I don't know, but I see a little certificate from the state that says this one has been certified. And we know that we even rely on our cereal boxes to have 14 ounces or 16 ounces or however many. When purchasing, you want to be traded fairly. And so it is interesting to see, even as far back as 5,000 years ago, there were some regulations that were put in place in order to ensure that people were treated fairly. They also, you can see within the Amarna letters that were found in Egypt of international commerce going on. You see one of the Pharaoh receiving letters from different kings and emperors from other kingdoms, and where they would send gifts. But these gifts were more things of samples of these are the products that we have, and they wanted to establish a trade relationship. We know, for example, Sidon and Tyre, they had the lumber, and they would float all of the trees down the Mediterranean. Can you imagine these barges that had some ropes and things like that, where they would have a flotilla of lumber, but it was the cedars of Lebanon that were so highly prized. And we read about that in the Bible with Solomon. He was kind of the middleman broker between what was going on in the African continent and what was going up in Asia. He was the middleman, and so he got a slice of the pie by brokering the deals and things like that. So
Well, as I
very
understand it, I mean, that's one reason why that territory is valued even today, quite
exactly.
aside from the religious quarrels that come up between the Arabs and the Christians and the Jews and everyone else who wants to fight over a slice of that pie religiously. But it is just a nexus of trade. If you
It
don't
is.
go through there, then you have to go through more difficult routes over water or over mountains or through desert. The Levant and the area around Jerusalem, I know there's one ancient map that has Jerusalem at the center of three like leaf-shaped items. One is Europe, one is Asia, and one is Africa. And at the
Yes.
center of all three of those leaves is Jerusalem. That is a very, I think, telling to how central that area was in all ways, including trade.
Well, and it's why God chose that spot. I really believe that he knew what he was doing. He also chose the time of the Roman period when there was the Pax Romana. Now it wasn't necessarily truly peaceful because it was enforced by military might, but still, if you were going to put your money anywhere, it was being invested in the temple or it was invested in your trade guild where you would and if we talk about what is a trade guild, I mean, we have things like that. We have the electrical workers, we have the unions, but the trade guilds were even more powerful. And a trade guild had to be approved by the Roman Senate, so it wasn't like anybody could do it, but you see evidences in the Bible of the stoneworker guilds. Paul was probably a member of a tent worker, leather worker guild. The trade guilds would in the city setting, they'd kind of replace the whole paterfamilia family. They were your family, they were your community. Back in the Roman culture, individualism was definitely not predominant like it is for us. But these trade guilds would if you belonged and were a member, they would take care of you. If you were having a personal shortage, they would make sure that their members were buried properly. It was very much of a community, and you interacted with this group of people. But they also controlled all of the inventory, and so even the supplies. Like if you were a metal worker, you couldn't get raw ore unless you worked within the trade guild. You couldn't sell your things unless you were a member of the trade.
Well, I want to look back a little bit to a couple of things you said that connect, I think, fairly directly with some of the passages here in the book of Revelation. And the first one, where you mentioned that the gold was basically either in a temple or in a trade. And that makes me think of one of the very first references to trades that I caught in the book of Revelation, which is in Revelation chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. This is a part of the message to Laodicea. And Jesus says to that church, because you are saying, I am rich and have become rich, and I have need of nothing, and you do not know that you're wretched and pitiable and poor and blind and naked, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire, in order that you may become rich, and white clothing, in order that you may be clothed, and the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and eye salve to smear on your eyes, in order that you may see. Part of the undercurrent of this message to Laodicea is you need to invest in your church family, in your fellow Christians, the way you have invested in these trade guilds. They're not your family. The church is your family. Your fellow Christians, that's the
Absolutely.
substitute for the paterfamilia, is Jesus and your family at church.
Yes, exactly. And that even if you have a material loss in wealth, you are putting the riches in heaven where they are safe and they will be saved and kept safe for you for eternity.
You talked about how if you weren't a member of the trade guild, you couldn't do business. You couldn't sell your goods. You couldn't get raw materials to make your goods. You had very few options if you had a skill but weren't part of the trade to do anything with it. Trade between a state and Rome required an authorization. You had to be officially recognized as a friend of Rome to do trade with Rome. If you didn't have the paperwork that said you were an authorized friend of Rome, then you didn't buy or sell in any Roman territory or to any Roman citizen, because you had to have that authorization, which puts me in mind of the mark of the beast. Just to quote from Revelation 13, 16, and 17. He causes all the people, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free and the slave, that they give them a mark on their right hand and on their forehead, and that no one was able to buy or to sell except the one who had the mark, the name of the beast or the number of his name.
Yep.
Now, there's a lot of discussions about the nature of this mark. Was it or will it be an actual physical branding of some nature? Is it just a spiritual metaphor? But what's often overlooked in the whole process is that the consequence of the mark is an economic consequence. You can buy or sell or not, whether you have the mark.
By marking it on the forehead as well as the hand, that means an ideological commitment. Mentally, you are assenting to participation with this. And then the marking on the hand would be the practical outworking of that orientation. So that's where the mark is that you have bought into this system and you are participating in the system. The Christians, on the flip hand, are losing their jobs and they're not able to find the work that they did. So they may have to do menial labor. They may, have subsistence farming that they're doing. The community itself is doing whatever they can to share their resources. And we have to keep in mind that there would have been a mixture of wealthy and poor, slaves and free in the Christian churches. And so they would pool their resources. You look at Paul, where he's on his mission and he's taking a collection to send to the Jerusalem church. So they did that for each other because they knew that they were the community that they had to support, just like the trade guilds would be that family that would help support the participants in that. This the Christian church, the ecclesia, was the community that they had to look to for that support and aid. Paul was very, very careful not to receive monies, and he talks about that not for personal work
Right.
or from his teaching. And the reason behind that had to do with the whole client patron relationship,
Right.
because if he took money, that would then mean that he was the client to a sponsoring patron, and there was obligation then, that an expectation that that sponsor, that patron is going to, I want you to vote this way, I want you to do these things, you need to do me a favor. I mean, that was really the grease of Roman life and Roman relationships. There was a client patron relationship at all different levels, within the empire. I mean, the Caesar would have been the top patron. A freed slave, his former master would always be a patron to him. And so it's interesting to see how Paul was very, very careful and very smart about not getting himself caught into that type of relationship so that he could remain free to do the work that he wanted to do and to belong to Christ.
Let's touch for a little bit on Revelation 6, 5 through 6, which I skipped over to get to Revelation 13. But in chapter 6, it's the breaking of the 6 seals on the scroll. And in verses 5 and 6, we read about the third scroll, the third seal. It says, "When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and the one seated on it had a balance scale in his hand. And I heard something like the voice in the midst of the four living creatures say, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the olive oil and the wine.'" Again, there's lots of different ways to go with exactly what do the seals mean, what is this black horse, and so on. But the scale is unmistakably a mercantile tool for measurement, and we're obviously talking about exorbitant prices for common goods. The
Yeah.
barley and the grain, those were staples of living in that world, and the oil and the wine were luxury items. So what do you see here in connection to trades or economics?
Yeah, what to me it indicates is that there could potentially be a famine that's coming. And it's going to affect predominantly the grains, which is why they're going to be rationed. But it's not such a severe famine that the wine and the oil will be affected. Unfortunately, a denarius is a day's wage, and what it's forcing the people to do, at least for a day laborer, is they have to choose: are they going to eat today, or are they going to pay their rent, or do they need new shoes, or something like that? A quart of wheat would feed one person for one day.
Mhm.
3 quarts of barley would probably be able to feed a small family for a day. So there's what we're talking about is basically you all during this period, you'll be able to buy food, but nothing else.
Hmm.
And so that is an extreme hardship, especially, and it's going to hit the Christians first, the hardest because of the whole if they're not collaborating with the system, um, they're not going to have a lot of resource to be able to afford the other things that they may need, such as, clothing, food, shelter, wine, or oil. And, you need a little bit of oil in order to cook. So, one day, you may have to buy the oil and try to cobble, don't eat a full loaf in one day, but try to portion it over a couple days so that you can afford to buy the oil.
Maybe part of this is that some features of economics are outside of human control. Oh, you can raise the prices arbitrarily. I understand that in Rome proper, Roman citizens did not pay for food. They were supplied food from the government for free as Roman citizens. Now, I don't know whether that this prices would mean that in times of difficulty, they're not going to get food for free because there's no food to be had for anyone, or what that might suggest. But governments can arbitrarily affect pricing for a while, but God is ultimately in control of the resources. The natural resources come under his control, especially for something like crops, which are so dependent on rain and good weather to grow properly. So, whatever Rome or any empire thinks they control, the means of production, they really don't.
Right.
God's always at the head of that means of production, and he controls it.
And but we do know that Rome would import food from Egypt. I mean, Egypt wound up being the breadbasket for many places.
Right.
But if there was a ship disaster, and a ship went down, that was a lot of grain that would have been lost. Yeah.
In fact, I want to move to our last passage, which is the longest one. And I think really one of the more surprising passages in all the book of Revelation, for all the difficulty of figuring out these beasts and all the complications of these seven seals and seven trumpets. What strikes me as odd is an emphasis on merchant activity. In when Babylon the Great falls in chapter 18 of the book of Revelation, there is an extended passage about all the trades that are impacted by the fall of Babylon. So I'm going to read Revelation 18, verses 11 through 19, uh, for a taste of this. And it's not actually the entire mention of mercantile trade. There's a little bit before and some after, but this is kind of the heart of the message here about the merchants mourning the fall of Babylon. So starting in verse 11. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple cloth and silk and scarlet cloth and all kinds of scented wood and all kinds of ivory goods and all kinds of goods of precious wood, and bronze, and iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and amomum, and incense, and ointment, and frankincense, and wine, and olive oil, and fine wheat flour, and wheat, and domesticated animals, and sheep, and horses, and carriages, and slaves, and human lives. And the fruit your soul desires has departed from you, and all the luxury and the splendor has perished from you, and they will never find them any more. The merchants of these things, who became rich for them, will stand far off, weeping and mourning because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, dressed in fine linen and purple cloth and scarlet cloth, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, because in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. And every shipmaster and every seafarer and sailors and all those who labor on the sea stood far off and began to cry out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, Who is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, in which all those who had ships on the sea became rich from her prosperity, because in 1 hour she has been laid waste.
The items that you listed are all luxury goods, and they were all always headed to Rome itself. There's also a lot of echoes in that this list of goods is similar to what is listed in Ezekiel 27. So
Hmm.
uh, uh, when he's talking about, he's condemning Tyre. And we know that Tyre was another merchandising. I mean, that's what they did, and they're
Right.
Phoenician traders, and those ships were the ships that everybody wanted to have because they were built so well to be able to do the long journeys. And so I really think what we're seeing here is it's a financial collapse. There's been a huge calamity. Think about the start of the depression here, where the stock market totally collapsed.
Right.
Or even in what was it, 2008, 2010, the housing market, where the stock market took a severe dip. I mean, I was so afraid to look at my 401k there for a while because I lost a significant chunk of money because of that. So this is something that could affect us today, even as it affected or has the potential to affect ancient Rome. Our economic security, I think it's a myth. I mean, it's more by luck and by manipulation than it is actually sustaining itself. The Fed puts in brakes and they're watching how much inflation do they want and how much interest rates they want to charge because they're trying to play this little game, but they're also jerking us around and the wealthy become wealthier and the poor become poorer.
The kind of feeling evoked in this passage was the kind of feeling that especially someone involved in trade and work had when COVID-19 shut down entire cities. When you could look at a street in Manhattan and it was vacant, a place that's normally thriving with activity and economic activity, specifically, people selling on the streets, restaurants and businesses open, and the lights going, and then all of a sudden it's dark and empty. And
Or you go to the grocery store and the shelves are empty.
right,
You know,
yes.
we didn't have a lot of meat in the meat case. There was no toilet paper. I still don't quite understand what the toilet paper deal was, but um and or then we also had ships that were in the ocean and there weren't any drivers to pick up the stuff, so then we had terrible
Right.
backlog with inventory of all types.
Let alone the fall of an entire government, which is what's being pictured here in Revelation. And I think Rome remains the primary imaginative symbol of this fall. In John's day, there was no other city that would represent world wealth and commerce better than Rome. So while I don't know that necessarily Revelation 18 is speaking about the fall of Rome, I think it's using all the imagery of what a fall of Rome would be, because that's what they imagined commerce was, and that was commerce in their world. And for Rome just to shut down and be destroyed. And I think the emphasis there twice in this passage, and it actually comes up outside of what I read, this idea that it fell in a day. It was Rome was the eternal city by the time of, I'm dating this at about 100 AD, but even if it's 60 AD, Rome had been around for nearly a millennia. In the days of its time as a republic, in the days of its time as an empire, which was actually a lot shorter by this time, but it had still been around for centuries. And John pictures it as falling in a day. Once God's judgment falls, it happens fast.
Yep. And yeah, I mean, look at things have to us happened. The COVID thing was just, it wasn't quite overnight, but it was months, boom,
Right.
weeks that this happened. The same thing with the stock market crash in back in the 20s, late 20s. It was, and people there they jumped from roofs, they laid on train tracks, they were committing suicide all over the place because they were financially ruined. This imagery is as real to us today as it was to John's audience.
As bad as COVID was, and as bad as the shutdown of Manhattan and of all of this economic activity, as bad as it looks like Revelation 18, that was just a taste of what God's ultimate judgment and wrath would be like. And like the book of Revelation, the point is you need to escape this because it's coming. You may think it's been bad the way you've encountered economic trials before. That's going to be worse. And you need to stay loyal to Christ because that is the only way through. Like to the Laodiceans, if you buy into the current economic system as your security, you're really poor and pitiable because there
Yes.
is no real security in the economic system of this world.
Right. And I think that's the strongest lesson that we can take is that to rely on our comforts. And I mean, the United States is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And even if we're just middle class, we're still far richer than most people on the planet. And so we have to, and when I read this and reflect on this, I'm like, how often am I actually caving and giving into the world and the riches and the glamour and all of that? I mean, I think of my 401k and it's like, oh, all of these things. And it's like to be self-reliant is both a good thing and a bad thing, because we really need to be dependent on God and God's provision, and God will provide. But it's not necessarily going to be at the level that we have grown accustomed to. It's his plan is not just for these few moments in this world, in this life. It's what's beyond the end, the day of the Lord. That's where his goal and his aim is. And as strong as we can, we need to grab hold of him and grab hold onto his economy. And yes, we have to live in this world and we need to be good citizens and do what we can to love and help each other. But don't rely on the material goods of this world because they're all vapor.
Bottom line. All right. I want to thank all of you for joining me today and Cindy as we look at the book of Revelation through the lens of merchant trades and economics. If you'd like to continue the discussion, please add a comment under the YouTube video or join us at Facebook at the Storm of Scripture discussion group. Next week, we will resume our walk through the Revelation verse by verse. But until we meet again, be well and then we will meet to examine the treasures in the biblical text.